this crisis without shelter. And this series was born from that. A couple weeks ago, we had a couple of our nonprofit partners that are on the ground, boots on the ground, telling us about what it's like and what they're seeing on the streets. We've got a couple other sessions in the works. This one in particular is very important to us. And so hopefully you get a lot out of it and you really understand from some very informed perspectives about social isolation and what it's like there out on the streets. So before we get started today, I'd like to welcome everybody and make sure that if you're not comfortable using Zoom, we've got a couple quick tips to make this go as smoothly as possible. We're actively trying to mute as many folks as we can. We had 262 folks register. That's a lot for a Zoom call. So we'll try and make sure folks are muted, except our panelists. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A session, make sure to use the button on the bottom left hand of your Zoom screen. You can also use the chat feature. It's highlighted here, and as folks begin to chat messages, you'll see it light up orange. And then also we have a speaker view. Want to thank Erica. Erica is my colleague, our manager of program operations, who's acting as our web series. And if, oh, it looks like we were able to mute everybody. Thank you, Erica. So thank you again, Erica, I should say, for pulling this together on the back end, along with my colleague, Rebecca Baer, Director of Community Engagement. She really has been piloting this series and using our platform to really build empathy and change a lot of perceptions. So thank you both. I want to first, if we could move to the next slide, Erica, I want to first talk a little bit about this subject and why it's so important to us. When Downtown Street Team was founded, we went out and did a survey. Our CEO and founder, who we'll hear from today, did a survey of the unhoused population in Palo Alto and asked them the question, among other questions, what's the worst part about being unhoused? And she certainly expected the answers like not being able to use the bathroom, my safety, it's cold at night, things that we so often associate with the experience of homelessness. And the results really surprised her. She was shocked to see so many different answers, like feeling alone, the way people look down on me, the way people avert their eyes, feeling marginalized, feeling like I have no dignity when I walk down the street. And that is, in addition to being heartbreaking, it really formed a lot of the foundation of the work that we do. We'll hear more about that later. And we get to see firsthand at Downtown Streets Team these detrimental effects so associated with social isolation. And our program inherently is trying to build community and break down that social isolation and bring people back into the community in a very positive way that they can feel good about. And so this is so much speaks to the heart and soul of the work that we do. And so we're so excited to share these perspectives and to have the guests that we do today. So if we go to the next slide, y'all have heard from me a bunch already. You don't need to hear more. My name's Chris Richardson, been with DST for 10 years, over 10 years now, as the second employee. And the woman who hired me, if we go to the next slide, you may notice has the same last name, our CEO and founder. She's been my boss for over 10 years. Well, I like to say she's been my boss for 33 years. She's also my mother. Eileen founded Downtown Streets Team in 2005 after volunteering at a food closet in downtown Palo Alto. Before then, she
a quick look.
Oh, got a little feedback there. Before founding Downtown Streets Team, she spent 15 years in venture capital and as a high-tech CEO. Probably most famously, she was the first CEO of Napster. Those were quite wild times. Fun times and super exciting, certainly. And upon volunteering in the food closet in Palo Alto, as she describes it, really fell in love with the men and women and found this missing piece in the continuum of care that would really allow them to make strides getting out of homelessness. A fun fact about Eileen, she made her county softball team in high school, and 2 years in a row, she was awarded Most Improved Player, which is hard to do. And that team in her senior year went onto the New York State Finals. They were called the Diamond Dolls. She wanted me to make sure that everybody knew that they were called the Diamond Dolls. So that's Eileen, our CEO and founder. Up next is Dr. Donna Tversky. Donna studied at Stanford, UCSF, and MIT, and it's at MIT where she actually discovered her passion for psychotherapy. She has worked on the Integrated Behavioral Health Ravenswood Family Health Center. She also owns her own psychotherapy practice, so she's quite a busy lady. She has a passion for working with unhoused populations, and this started rearing its head when she was in high school, and she did a lot of work in college, in undergrad as well. She specializes in trauma, which is one of the reasons we asked her to be here today, to really relate and draw the line between trauma and social isolation. And she likes to use that expertise for nonprofits like Downtown Streets Team or our partner Peninsula Health Care Connection, where she serves on the board. A fun fact about Donna is that while she was living in South Africa, she wrote and helped run a newspaper for and by unhoused individuals. While she was there, she also helped reduce the stigma for AIDS and HIV in a professional capacity. Next up is my colleague, Romy Knowledge. Romy has her master's in integral counseling psychology. She's a licensed MFT and AFMT, I got it. She joined DST last year as the senior director of our San Francisco branch and also social innovation. She's got quite the resume, so I'm going to just pick pieces of it. She's worked with Abode Services, Community Housing Partnership. She worked at San Quentin in their restorative justice program. Like I said, her resume is quite long. Those are just 3 stops along the way. And she's been working with underserved populations since she was a teenager, a young teenager. She also runs her own consultation and psychotherapy practice, where she teaches her self-created tree method, which is a therapeutic approach to problem solving and behavioral management for organizations and individuals. And a fun fact about Romy, she's a graduate of the National Outdoor Leadership School, or NOLS. It's part of a family tradition that extends a few generations for her. And that includes her living out of a backpack in Colorado for 2 months. She told me about this story yesterday, just yesterday, that on her very first day in this 2-month sojourn in Colorado, she fell down a hill, ripped a huge hole in the only pair of shorts that she had, and had to sew the hole up with dental floss. So that's Romy. Last but not least, our special guest today is a gentleman named Coach. He is one of our San Francisco team members. In fact, Coach is our team lead for our mission team in San Francisco. He's going to bring us some firsthand experience and perspective on what it's like to be outside, to live outside, and to face this social isolation. He offered to participate and, quite frankly, lobbied to participate for this, which I think is incredibly brave, and have to thank you so much, Coach. I got to meet him briefly earlier, and I can't wait to hear more about your perspective there. Fun fact, oh, excuse me, I'm missing one piece of Coach's resume. He taught restorative justice and healing center approaches to other inmates while he was at San Quentin, which I thought was incredible. Fun fact I learned about Coach, he played professional football for the Denver Broncos as a defensive end, among a couple other stops along the way. So thank you to our panelists for being here today. I can't wait to dive deep on this topic with you all and with your expertise. So before we get to Q&A, can we go and maybe just do a panel view, Erica? And we'll get right into it. We're going to keep this pretty tight today. So start off with you, Eileen. Can you please tell us why this topic is so important to you?
Do it.
And also how it formed the foundation of the work that Downtown Streets Team does. Unfortunately, you're muted right now.
Okay, so now I'm not muted, I imagine. Sorry about that. Yes, as you mentioned, we did a survey back in 2006 about what are the worst things about being homeless. And it wasn't I'm scared or hungry or any of the things that you might imagine. It was across the board, the way people look down at me, the way I am alone. And so Downtown Streets Team builds this community around men and women where we work together hand in hand, almost as a family, to support each other getting out of homelessness. And so we have a weekly meeting where you come in and there's clapping and hugging and rah, rah, yay, yay. And it's really this, this community where men and women can lean on each other, can be motivated by one another, but most importantly, have a place to go that they can almost call home, but also a place where they no longer are isolated in the devastation of homelessness on the street alone. And I always say that to get out of homelessness when you're isolated, and we'll talk about what that feels like, and of course we're all feeling that right now in this time of COVID, but when you're isolated, it's almost impossible to wake up one day and say, I know, I think I'll go get a job today. Not only are the systems such that just being homeless alone and experiencing that means you are, it's the equivalent of us standing in 4 DMV lines per day. That's what it takes just to survive out there. So now you're isolated, you are potentially depressed, and you have to go and stand in line after line by yourself, no friends, no family. It's pretty treacherous. And so DST has grown up based on what men and women that are experiencing homelessness have told us works for them, and by gut. And I'm very sad to say that in this time, I'm not sure when we'll be able to get back to the place where we all sit in a room together and get up and hug each other and motivate one another, because that's core to what we've done in the past. What I do know is we'll figure it out, even if we have to get bigger spaces and be 6 feet apart and just wave at each other or something. But it's that sense of community that gets folks out of isolation that's so important.
Thank you for that. And that's important. I know, having been there at the foundation of Streets Team, and one thing that always has gotten me so passionate about this is seeing people experiencing that isolation. Downtown Streets Team being a way or a pathway for folks to get out of that and share community and build community together is so incredibly important. So Romie, you've been working with people experiencing homelessness, as I mentioned, since you were a very young woman. Can you tell us a little bit about what social isolation means to you, what you've seen, and why, how devastating its effects can be?
Yeah, totally. I can see social isolation in a few different ways. One being that being unhoused, we as a society at times can feel really uncomfortable looking at people who are unhoused. In turn, we support ourselves and the comfortability of our world by shunning or looking away. And in most cases, that in return can have the unhoused population feel extremely invisible. We're both in a fearful state, I would say, in a lot of the interactions that the public has with the unhoused population and the unhoused with the public. I think fear is a big piece to social isolation on both sides. Also, that invisibility can absolutely manifest in the detrimental effects of people having a lack of worth, a lack of belonging. It can compromise someone's ability to find their own identity and being confident with that identity. And also understanding one's sense of self in regards to other people and in that relationship. I think a lot of the time social isolation can look like, to the unhoused population, whatever's happening over there in the world or whatever society is engaged in over there is not for me. And that being reinforced over and over again can really be detrimental to the thought process of any unhoused folk being like, well, what is for me? And that can feel extremely isolating on so many fronts, pandemic or not. And so when thinking about kind of the detrimental effects to this, I really think of identity. I think of self-worth. I think of who am I in this world and is that good enough? Because the effects of social isolation can really create a narrative in one's head that can be really negative and hurtful over time to one's confidence and to one's feeling of being a belonging in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And appreciate your perspective outside of just your work with Downtown Street Team, the many organizations and people that you've worked with. So moving on to Dr. Tversky, can you help us bridge the gap or maybe draw some parallels, I guess, with the social isolation that everybody's feeling right now at home, not having seen their friends or family, even their coworkers for the last month or so, and kind of touch on what Romy and Eileen just talked about, and how maybe some of us can build some empathy or draw those parallels with folks that experience this even outside of COVID.
Yeah, like how long do I have? There's so much that all makes me think of. Like starting with one thing, I mean, you don't need a psychiatrist to tell you that we need people. We are fundamentally social creatures and interdependent. And, even when I see the reactions to COVID kind of globally in the newspaper, you see there's pockets of our communities that are holding fear, pockets that are holding denial, not that big, pockets that are holding different things. And you can kind of look at all of us as one large organism. And we really need each other. Like we know that when we're deprived of basic social connection, organisms like us, we don't actually survive. And I think we can all probably relate to the experience of, like, I don't know if you've stumbled across a neighbor or something like that recently and actually felt how good it is to run into someone and just have that kind of connection. And so there's all kinds of different types of connection that we need. We need people who know us and respect us. We also need belonging, to belong to a community. We also need those casual interactions with grocers and neighbors and friends like that, because that all supports our own sense of self. So I guess one thing maybe I'll say, because I really could talk about this for a very long time, but that is one function we really serve for one another is a kind of mirroring function. So if you laugh at my jokes, and I'm looking at you, Chris, now because you're on my screen, thank you, or you respect the work I do, I then get to feel like a kind of funny person or someone that has some value in the world. And that's really helpful for my own sense of self. This is very much kind of riffing on what Romy was saying. Okay, small little aside here is, I haven't met a single person who has been unhoused who doesn't have some form of PTSD, okay, or what I would call complex trauma. And that's another conversation we could have. But that means that their own, without getting into technical definitions, their concepts of self are not robust. They do not live in a world where things are secure and they are good. They live, as Romy was saying, with a constant sense of fear. Now, the more trauma we've had in our lives, or the more predisposed to anxiety or depression, the more likely we are to live with kind of unpleasant roommates, like voices that are going to tell us that we're inadequate, unworthy, that other people are untrustworthy, that the world is unsafe. That's a really bad climate to be left alone with. And I think that's true whether you're housed or not, right? We can be good company for ourselves. We can be bad company for ourselves. And that to me is also one of the functions that we serve for one another, and why I love DST and why I love good jobs is because when we go to work and when we interact with people who respect us, who can look us in the eye and appreciate what we're doing, we feel better about ourselves. And it's not superficial. We remember the parts of ourselves that are good and respectable and deserve good things. And so, and I think we can all probably recall days where you wake up and you just don't feel like going to work, or it's like, I can't take care of another person. I can't be a mom today. I just don't have it. And then you go through the motions and you actually feel a little bit better because that part of you was brought forward and elicited. And that's a real part. And so that's just a little piece of the functions that we serve for one another. But there's a lot more to say in there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for using vocabulary that those of us who got a C in high school biology can still wrap our heads around. I appreciate that. I also think you you hit the nail on the head with our theme here today, which is, you know, folks that are living out on the street are experiencing probably a heightened form of this social isolation, especially
Oh,
with PTSD.
yes. And one more thing, if I can just add in there, is that makes it particularly hard for people who are living on the streets now is as isolated and alone as we can all feel right now. And there are, you know, there's data showing what happens to us when we're in quarantine and we're isolated, and it's not good. There is a bit of a silver lining in that we are actually all in it together. And so we can have conversations like this. We can get together in groups and complain about it or whatever. And for homeless people, that's not the case, because when there aren't people trying to make bids for connection and saying like, we're all in this together. I mean, there are the DSTs, there are the programs, but that's not the common experience. And that makes it very different and more traumatic.
Thank you for making that point. It's something that's easy to forget for all of us, and we can all lean on each other now. And that's incredibly helpful. We also have the tools, quite frankly, like Zoom here, like Facebook. One of the things that maybe a lot of folks don't realize is the folks that are living outside, especially under current conditions, don't have a place to even charge their phone, let alone a laptop to stream Netflix when they're, you know, just wanting to shut the world out, let alone connections with family on Facebook that they can communicate with. You know, I was FaceTiming my grandmother earlier today, and it's really nice to be able to have that connection, which is just not available to most of the folks living on the streets. Which is a great segue, because Coach, you're up next. You know, you've lived through this experience, and so can you speak to what everybody's talking about right now? Can you frame it for us from your own personal, you know, your eyes? What is it like out there on the streets? Maybe feeling alone. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this feeling of social isolation, what does it mean to you?
Isolation is similar to being in prison. You feel all alone, and that you're by yourself. And actually, the time I did do in prison helped prepare me for what I'm going through now. Even though it is by choice, I still understand what it's like, the isolation. I know what it's like firsthand to feel like you're alone in this world. And it really hurts me when I see people, those that have looked down upon the people that they bleed or the have-nots. You know, they don't understand that people just didn't wake up one morning and decide, you know, I'm going to be homeless. You know, I want to live out in the street. And it's just, you feel like you're all alone. And I think part of the problem too, that leads to another problem, that is perhaps your mate that you live with, you know, it could be a female, or if, you know, you're living with a couple of guys, you end up lashing out, and it even tears you apart even more. I've seen that happen. People that, we're not going through this epidemic that we're going through now. They're able to get out and do things during the day, go here, and, you know, be with other people. But now they're confined by themselves, you know, in their tent or to their, you know, the block they live on. And, you know, you can be, you know, get tired of each other after a while, you know, and that's one of the big problems I see out there with the isolation. I would think it could be a positive, though, in that I don't think we communicate very well with each other out here in society. We get real judgmental about people, what we think, instead of actually just talking to them and communicating. And I think that's something that could be a negative, could be turned into a positive, where now that people are confined, communicate with each other, learn more about each other.
Yeah, and Donna brought that up too. You know, how we yearn for that communication, and I think a lot of us are being a little bit more open to that these days. We live in worlds where we're kind of connected to our phones, and we have this bubble around us. Don't get into my space, and we're kind of yearning for more connection these days. I waved to someone walking down my block today. Basically, was pulling out, kind of cut him off by accident. Was wave, I'm so sorry. And he gave me a big smile and waved back at me. And so hopefully that's one of the silver linings from us all going through this together, like Dr. Tversky has mentioned. We, you know, I forgot to mention earlier, we posted a couple links in the chat at the very top of the chat box. So if you go to the very bottom of your screen, right next to the share button, there's a chat button. And you can see some of these links. There are a couple links there, things you can do to help, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the first link that we we posted was a link to our Just Say Hi video. And Eileen, can you talk a little bit more about the impetus for this video and the idea behind Just Say Hi? I think that's pretty important. And you're muted again, so you'll have to unmute yourself. I apologize.
Sure. Thank you. Just Say Hi was something that we had kicked off as a campaign when we first got to San Francisco. We realized we were the new kids in town and people didn't know who we were. And we really wanted our folks to be recognized, and we wanted to break down the barriers between folks that are isolated on the streets and the community at large, if you will. And it's so scary, not only for the folks that are experiencing homelessness, as we just discussed about the fear they're facing, but it's also, especially in a city like San Francisco, that it has such a small square mile radius and is very densely populated, where when people are walking over folks that are experiencing and suffering from homelessness, they really don't know what to do. And it's not that they don't want to help, but they don't know what to do. And they are scared also sometimes. And so to start breaking it down at its most basic level, the campaign was just say hi. That's all you have to do. If you see somebody in one of our yellow shirts, wave to them, say hi, you make their day, and you feel better about yourself, but you're breaking down that barrier. And that barrier has to be broken down, in our opinion, because if we stay the way we are now, where we have NIMBYs on one side and homeless advocates on the other, we're never going to build a housing or create the kind of community that we all want to live in. And so that was the impetus for it. Now you're muted. Tag.
Sorry, yes. We're dealing with these technical issues like all of us these days. It's a quick video. If you want to check out the link, Just Say Hi. I've seen it probably 100 times, and I still kind of get a little teary every single time. It's a really great message that is very much trying to break down those barriers that create social isolation. So Downtown Streets team, as I'd mentioned, is all about building this community and connecting people to each other and supporting each other and holding each other accountable and providing value to one another, like Dr. Tversky talked about. And that is just not possible in the same way in these times of COVID. So Romie, I'm going to ask you, you've got a lot of experience on the ground with our team members and managing a large crew of our direct service staff that manages and works with team members on a daily basis. How has this epidemic changed the way that we approach working with team members? We talked a little bit 2 weeks ago about what we're doing operationally, but tell me a little bit more about the approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure if you guys talked about us more operationally, you guys know that we aren't necessarily seeing each other physically on a day-to-day basis. So connection has really been across phone calls and just that consistency of staying in touch, whatever way that looks like. And then obviously when we do come in for our paid payouts, it could be a light touch of just saying hi and just kind of what Donna was saying, that neighbor effect of just being like, oh, I can have a moment of just interaction with someone that I know and it's familiar and safe. But in general, it's not that complicated. We are trying to stay in touch with our team members every day to every other day. If that's via the phone, or if team members don't have phones, it's trying to get in touch with them via other team members or other creative and strategic ways. I know that has affected not only the staff, but definitely the team members. I mean, the team members, like Eileen was mentioning, they joined DST to have that structure, to have that purpose, to have that community, to have that hoorah energy around them. So to have that taken away in such a, I would say, abrupt way, makes everyone just like us, just like everyone on this call probably has felt stir crazy and a little bit like, oh my gosh, when can my body feel normal again? And when can I go and feel like I'm doing something with not only myself, but with others, with my friends, with my community. So that's definitely a big change. And so our approach is consistency. I think that is the biggest and most important aspect of our approach right now is consistency. We have such an opportunity right now to reinforce that our team members and that our community is loved and cared about, because there's been so many times in the history of people being in the unhoused community where abandonment has been a very real thing. A lot of times in their life. Service providers and going through the system, you end a journey with a case manager at times or all the time. That relationship can end through a bureaucratic sense or just a logistical sense before people can even know it. And that can reinforce trauma. That can reinforce our unhoused population not being worthy, not feeling valued, and not being cared in a consistent or unconditional level. So one of the most important things right now is to stay as consistent to the point of almost being annoying. I think that definitely some of the staff I talk to on a daily basis are like, I called again. And they were like, you called yesterday. I'm doing all right. Thanks. And I'm like, fine, be the annoying mother or father that just won't stop calling, because that actually can be an experience of healing for them in their experience, going through such an institutionalized system and being so used to having people in their corner that go in and out, in and out, in and out. So how we approach this is staying connected on an unconditional and consistent level to actually use this time as a reinforcement of their value rather than not, because it's a very, very, very slippery slope in times of struggle that direct service or relationships can go down the tube. And that can just reinforce historical trauma very fast. And actually, if anyone knows what self-fulfilling prophecies are, they actually get filled pretty easily. If someone has one that has a core belief that I am not cared about, that someone leaving and abandoning them actually reinforces that I'm right. I am not cared about. And so by us being like, no, what you think's gonna happen isn't gonna happen, because I'm going to continue to call you and annoy you and see if you need anything or count down the days until I see you at payout, is actually a really healing experience. So that is definitely our approach right now.
Thank you. You answered multiple follow-up questions that I would have had. I appreciate that. I think it's also important to recognize and know that the folks on our team and involved in a lot of other organizations were working incredibly hard to move themselves out of the experience of homelessness, whether it's working towards employment or housing or income, removing all sorts of barriers that have kept folks on the streets. And it's incredibly hard. We talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, in general, to get out of the experience of homelessness. But when half the services are closed down and you have no way to get a deposit for your rent, which is pretty universal right now, it can be incredibly tough. Having said all that, I know we're not the only folks seeing a lot of success right now, but I just talked to one of our project managers yesterday. 5 folks since the outbreak hit and we closed up shop on March 9th in this single community got employed, and another 3 households, including one household with 2 kids, got into housing. So we're still moving forward with a lot of these folks, but it's harder than ever, and we have to consider that, especially for folks that have been let down by so many different systems. It can be incredibly demotivating to feel that social isolation. And so the fact that they're overcoming these barriers right now of all times is truly incredible. The folks on the Downtown Streets team, I can speak for them, and a lot of other folks that we've worked with through the years are incredibly resilient people. You could make a movie about each one of their lives, an inspiring movie. And it's why we have the best job in the world, quite frankly. So back to you, Dr. Tversky. I wanted to ask you, why is it so important for folks to stay connected now? And we're talking about connection, not just Zoom calls with family, but connected to their community in general, connected to the folks experiencing homelessness, connected to causes and things that matter. Why is connection more important now than ever?
Gosh, I mean, I would say connection is just always important. Like, we know that intuitively, and we know that because we have lots of, just to like look at research and that kind of thing, is that we know that being socially connected is as good for your long-term health as not smoking, regular sleep, and diet. Like, social connection is that important. and a lack of it. There's lots of big studies that have looked at this. There was one that had over 300,000 people and found that a lack of social connection increased the risk of premature death, so just dying of anything, by 50%. And that's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Like, it is real. And I think we know that intuitively, but we certainly have, data from all over the place kind of reinforcing that. And especially in times when we're left alone in our own, homes, like finding those different ways to connect with others. And we all know it. It just feels better. Now, that said, there is one, it's tough because just thinking about the company we keep also matters. And so this is a time where, one of the first things that I thought about with the prolonged quarantine, especially when it was unknown, because uncertainty is a lot harder for us than actually bad news often, which is in people that, are experiencing homelessness or live in unsafe homes. So I thought I was, instantly got worried about domestic violence and child abuse and increases in substance abuse, the ways that loneliness can lead to depression and, loss of life there. So it also matters who you're close to. And we know that there are people in our lives that can make our nervous systems escalate in ways that are unhealthy. And there are people in our lives that can make our nervous systems calm down such that we feel safe again. And of course, safety is key for everything.
Yeah, mothers are the worst there, right? Usually.
Oh, good mothers, the best.
I'm just seeing a lot of comments, trying to keep up with my notes and the conversation, but I'm reading some really great comments. Please keep them coming and feel free to ask any questions. If we can't get to them today, we'll certainly get in touch and answer. And a lot of support for Coach. And that's another good segue. People have really appreciated you sharing your story. So I'm going to ask you to answer one more question two more questions for us, but first directed just to you, Coach. How are you getting by these days? How are you filling your time out there on, without Downtown Streets team? And what are some of the things you need? Feel free to take that, whether it's a pair of socks or, a good friend to call, take that in any direction you'd like. Let us know what's going on out there.
I'm getting by. I try and look at just take it one day at a time, like the days when, AA and A, like they say, if I look at it and try and think 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead, I get depressed. So just one day at a time and take it as it goes. I try and make the best of each day. And I do get bored not working. People think, well, you're crazy, you're retired. I said, that's why I keep working to stay busy. And that's something I really miss. Some days can be rough when I'm out here when it's raining, or perhaps I set up my temporary place for the night and some guy comes out of his house or a woman comes out of her house and wants you to move, and that can be difficult, but basically I'm fine. And what I try to do is help other people. I realize that we're all going through the same thing. We're not going through this, by ourselves, and communicate with them and let them know that, hey, you're not the only one going through this. Is there anything I can do for you? And a lot of times I think if it's just a smile or a hi, or do you need anything? Can I help you? That's all people need. I think I just say it takes 1,000 muscles to frown, but only a lot less to just smile at someone. And a smile, a smile is great. And I also understand a lot of times you might, speak to someone and they might growl at you, but they're not mad at you really or upset with you. You're just the object of their frustration. And this is a very frustrating time for all of us. I think there's a lot of positives and negatives out in the street. I think the negatives is the lack of services that we're able to get, the lack of restrooms and showers. Just today, though, I did notice that some of the portable toilets have been placed around, and they have around the mission area, and there's an attendant for 8 hours a day to make sure they're clean and everything. And they're open 24 hours, which I've always felt they should be anyway. Lack of housing and shelter for some people, lack of clothing for a lot of people, and traveling, transportation-wise, really has messed up the schedules for a lot of people that don't have a vehicle, with BART having a different schedule, and the buses, I can't believe I actually read it, but the drivers are only allowed to have 10 people on a bus, but they're not doing that. There's many more people on the bus, and they jam a lot of people in there. It's like we're livestock, and people get upset, and that's a problem. But with all the negatives, there's also a lot of positives. Food is plentiful. I've always felt you can't go hungry in this town. There's just so many services. A lot of people giving food. You go to a lot of places and they provide hand sanitizer, socks, masks, and other hygiene items, and I think that's great. And I guess different groups are making those things available. And the tents that are moved around by Department of Public Works or the police after a few days or whatnot, they're pretty much have been in place for a while now, and I've noticed that people are that are using that for their living area. It's a lot cleaner. They're keeping it clean. So there's some. It's every negative. There's a lot of positives too.
Yeah, I think, and I saw one question come through. I'm gonna mess this up. It looks like revfic at gmail.com asked about advocacy, and I think one of the silver linings for this whole crisis is that it may really open a lot of opportunities up for advocacy in terms of funding for permanent solutions, permanent shelter, permanent housing, obviously the ultimate goal. And we'll provide, to answer that question, we'll provide a one resource at the end of the event today about how you can get involved from the safety of your house in that advocacy. And Coach, thank you again for your perspective. You can all see, I just met Coach today on the webinar. You can see why he's one of our team leaders in San Francisco with a heart like his. Thank you for your message. And you're getting a lot of love here on the chat box. I'll make sure to share all that with Romy so she can share it with you as well. But keep it up and keep smiling. I do want to close out before we get to Q&A, and we are going to keep this to an hour. Really concisely for each one of our panelists, I want to ask you, what is your suggestion for how we can be more inclusive and reduce social isolation for the folks living on the street? What's one thing each and every one of us could do moving forward? I know that's a pretty loaded question, but I want to hear your perspective. And Mom, we'll start with you.
One thing, if there was one thing, I think right now it would be getting phone chargers to our men and women to keep them connected so that they could keep receiving our annoying phone calls. It may sound simple, but I think we've come to depend on our phones as a lifeline really to everything, certainly to knowing when the library is open and closed and all of that sort of thing. They become much more important in a crisis like this. And they can also be used sometimes for entertainment, etc. And if the library is closed or you can't charge your cell phone anymore, then it's a real issue. And so if there was one small thing that people could do, I think that would be it.
Oh, thank you. And we're already seeing the same person from Gmail is offering to send them. So we'll get you that information for sure.
That's Reverend Franny, and she's been working with me for, I don't know, 16 or 18 years doing the Thanksgiving meal. Okay. And her family's amazing supporter, DST and all things homeless issues and everything else. So thank you, Franny.
Thank you indeed. Okay, Dr. Tversky, do you have anything, any suggestions for us, how we can eliminate social isolation?
Yes, I'm going to ask Coach, and then I'm going to repeat whatever he says.
Okay. Coach, you're up next. I think I know your answer already. I think you touched on it, but point blank, what can we all do to reduce this social isolation that folks are experiencing on the street and now everybody's experiencing?
Communication. People just don't communicate. The only way you can find out what's going on with someone is to talk to them, and be a good listener too. A lot of times people will be talking and I don't respond, and they go, "Aren't you listening to me?" I said, "Yes, that's what I'm doing." Yeah, I'm listening to you. And I hear. And I really feel that if we communicate more, and it's something, 2013 when I got out of prison, one of the first things I noticed in the streets was people don't talk like they used to. Everybody's on their cell phone. I'd see people on the BART train on their phones talking to each other. on the same car, 20 feet apart. I just go, my goodness, talk to each other. But I think that's if we communicate, we learn more about each other and we understand each other. And I think when you understand someone, be it negative or positive, it makes everything go a lot smoother in relationships.
Yeah, I was going to ask him last because I knew he was going to steal all the good ideas and package them. So I'm putting you in a tough position, but Donna, if you want to echo that, that's more than fine.
Yeah, and I love just say hi too. But yes, I'll just go with Coach.
Fair enough. Romie?
Yeah, I definitely, in the essence of Coach, one of the reasons I joined DST was because of the essence of the just say hi. Like, we as a community have the power to humanize and create a situation less painful for everyone. So acknowledge and respect and be compassionate, especially through these times of all of us being isolated. I hope that we can use this time as a reminder that we have a common experience now. So there shouldn't be any reason why we can't humble ourselves and be present to the problem and acknowledge that fear is only coming from a place of discomfort, and that, like Coach said, getting to know individuals creates a lot more compassion and tolerance for new and exciting relationships to form.
Great. We've got a little bit of time. If we want to go back to the presentation for Q&A, we've got about 8 minutes. I did see one come through that definitely sparked my interest. I'd love to ask a couple of our panelists particularly, but I'm trying to wade through, and there's so many.
Chris, there was one I thought that Romie and or Donna would want to take. And
I'm getting to that one. I know exactly which one it is. So Kanita Watson asked, do introverts deal better with social isolation? Does it have some sort of, is there less negative impact on their health than, for example, extroverts? And I want to ask the two people with a lot of letters behind their names for this. So whoever wants to take that first, Donna or Romie.
I think the researcher should go first on this one.
As a reader of research, I can't give you a really referenced answer. I think there are smaller studies, probably not necessarily during quarantine or anything like that I could quote, but that, and you probably have a sense of this from friends, that some people that even have relief at the quarantine situation, which is like, oh, now I can only interact with the small group of people that live right here, and that there can be a relief for that. However, those people also need social connection. So it's not that introverts don't also need that. And, when I'm working as a therapist, it's kind of fun to have, explore as people kind of come to know that for themselves. Is like, well, normally I don't like being around people, but now I'm finding like I feel funny, I feel off, I miss this. And so I really think it does affect people across the board, introvert or extrovert, but that there are probably some sort of more immediate reliefs for introverts and discomforts for extroverts.
yes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. This is actually really interesting because I was talking with the team member about this yesterday, and they brought up a really great point around being an introvert. Yes, of course, you're naturally going to tolerate being alone a little bit better. But what this pandemic is doing is not necessarily saying like, you who don't like to necessarily be in the energy of a lot of people at the same time, go over here and like, you're cool. And then the extrovert, you're going to suffer. I don't necessarily think that outside of social interaction not being accessible, choice has been taken away from us. And I think if anything, yes, while the introvert might not get stir crazy in a month, but maybe 2 months, they still don't have choice as to what they want to do or where they want to go or who they want to see. And I think in any experience of an introvert or extrovert, that is definitely not very comfortable and can be a shared experience of no fun. So yes, while I think that just tolerance levels and maybe like the time sensitivity might be different. I think altogether, isolation has more components of just being alone.
Thank you both for that very much. The next question I see is from Linda Lenoir, and hi, who asks, San Francisco has secured thousands of hotel rooms for unhoused. What has SEC, and I assume Santa Clara County, done? We do have a response here on the chat line from my colleague Amanda Olson, that Santa Clara County has secured motel rooms for people experiencing homelessness who have either contracted COVID-19 or are extremely medically vulnerable. Amanda is speaking from experience. She's our Sunnyvale project manager and is running a pretty major project in the largest shelter in Santa Clara County. I'd also just add that there are a couple other smaller scale maybe programs, including a program that was highly utilized in the first couple days of shelter in place for folks to stay in housing. That's another concern that, you know, sometimes we don't think about. And certainly a lot of folks are facing homelessness potentially for the first time, which is incredibly scary. And so trying to keep them in the housing is important as well. Also, it's important to note that every community or every continuum of care, which is usually based in and around a county, is dealing with this in a very unique and individual way. There are funding from, you know, the feds and from the state, but they're having to be very flexible with the resources they have. So the response is not going to be the same. It allows for flexibility, for creativity, and for a lot of times a very rapid response, but it's not as coordinated, and it's, you know, the resources are not the same between sometimes even towns, neighboring towns. East Palo Alto in San Mateo County and Palo Alto, you know, are responding to this in very different ways. I'm going to go through and see if there's any other comments. If anybody wants to ask one of our panelists a question, just make sure to unmute yourself. That's that little microphone looking button at the bottom left corner. I got another one from Sonia Stamper, who asked, did she, and I'm assuming she means Dr. Tversky, say that lack of connection increases dying by 50%? It wasn't a direct, like if you don't connect right now, but Donna, do you want to address that a little bit more?
You know, that's kind of right, that it increases all-cause or decreases all-cause mortality by 50%. So that, yeah, it's real. It's a real health risk.
And you also have to consider the, you know, the mortality rate of unhoused individuals already. You know, their
Yes.
average lifespan is so much less than folks who have been in housing their whole lives. And so if you compound this on top of that, there's a lot of really scary implications, quite frankly. With no more questions, I'm going to wrap up maybe a couple minutes early, but I wanted to move on about what can you do to help. And there's a couple of suggestions that we have during, you know, these are applicable certainly beyond COVID and beyond shelter in place, but they're especially important now. We mentioned Just Say Hi. We posted the link now twice. I saw Greg, thank you for posting that again a little bit earlier. One little note that, you know, us from Downtown Streets team, we always like to give this tip. You can always carry things in your car in your glove box. If you see someone, for example, panhandling, and you don't feel comfortable giving them money, for example, you can always give them a pair of socks. That's highly requested. Gift cards to even Starbucks or Safeway, prepackaged food. You know, obviously nowadays we'd hope you'd sanitize that. Hygiene kits are always in demand. And then obviously these days, hand sanitizer, gloves, masks, toilet paper, anything you could spare. To make that human connection, to show that you care, to show that you recognize your shared humanity. And quite frankly, it's a good way to strike up a conversation, especially now that we have this shared experience, which is certainly one of the themes for today. There are also, you know, if you're in a situation where you could volunteer, there are plenty of places that are accepting and looking, quite frankly, for volunteers these days. We had Yul Sterner from Hunger at Home last week. He is repurposing food that would otherwise go to waste for organizations like Downtown Streets Team throughout the Bay Area. He's looking for volunteers, and this link right here, which was posted earlier, will help you find a local provider that is actively looking for volunteers nowadays. donate. Obviously, our expenses at Downtown Streets Team have actually gone up during the time of COVID, even though we're not out there in the streets, and we're not alone in that. So a lot of nonprofits are really putting in a lot of hours. We're working more than ever. Resources can sometimes be uncertain for a nonprofit. They're especially uncertain now. And so one way to certainly help now more than ever is by donating. In fact, we were able to raise over $1,000 from folks attending this webinar and folks that couldn't make it. So very much appreciated to all of you who chipped in and donated. We'll put that money to good use, and thank you very much. And then lastly, to address one of the other questions we had earlier, you can advocate. This is something you can do for free from the safety of your own living room or wherever you're working from home these days. Should you be working from home. So you can write to your city council member, your county, and make sure that they're, giving enough resources to this issue. There's a couple of links that we provided as well. The National Low Income Housing Coalition and the Alliance to End Homelessness both have advocacy pages where you can basically put in your zip code and it'll populate a template for you that it'll send out to your representatives at the federal and state level. This is incredibly helpful to tell our representatives that they should be considering not just the economy and not just folks out of work, but folks experiencing homelessness when they're making policy decisions and when they're allocating huge resources to the response to COVID. And so we'd appreciate your help in that as well. Make sure to keep on advocating for affordable housing and for programs like Downtown Streets Team and Peninsula Healthcare Connection to address this issue beyond shelter in place. With that, I'll say we have a couple more of these planned in the works. Please stay tuned. We've got some exciting topics and some really awesome panelists coming up, and we'll make sure to notify you about that. I want to thank everybody for attending and incredibly engaging conversation on the chat. And then obviously our panelists, Donna, thank you so much for always lending a hand and your expertise to Downtown Streets Team. My colleagues, certainly Eileen and Romy, thank you for all the work that you do. And Coach, you are probably the most popular guy on the internet at this very moment. Thank you for sharing your perspective. You've got a lot of fans these days. With that, please just say hi and thank you so much for attending.